All right, so this video is going to talk about efficiency, and it's going to use the PPF. I already had a video to show how we would draw the PPF. So once we have the video, once we have the production possibilities for an economy, the production possibilities frontier for an economy drawn, um, then we can talk about exactly what we mean by efficiency. And efficiency is a really important idea in economics. And so we can get a first way of looking at efficiency here with the PPF. So we've drawn the PPF, and as you remember, for a given economy at a given point in time, that PPF would be drawn based on the resources that we have, the inputs, the raw materials we need to produce goods and services, and then the technology for converting those inputs or resources into the goods or services we have. And that gives us the black production possibilities frontier here. Now, we've the PPF shows us feasibility. It shows us what's possible, and this is really important because in economics we don't actually see this frontier in the world. This is a very nice diagram for helping us to conceptualize or think about feasibility, but we never know exactly what's feasible in the world. So we need to think, we need to think carefully or try to figure out what would be feasible. But anything that would be on the frontier or inside the frontier would be feasible. I can't contrast any point that's beyond the production possibilities frontier is not feasible. So that's what the PPF shows us. Then beyond this, we can talk about efficiency. Now, when we do economics generally, whenever we do any kind of analysis, we try to make it as general as possible. What they mean by that is we don't want to make our analysis depend on specifically what people might like or dislike. When we get to supply and demand, we'll hope to have a theory of how markets work that's kind of robust to the fact of do people in an economy at a given point in time like ice cream or do they like frozen yogurt or do they like fruits and nuts or whatever. So we don't want a theory of how markets work to say we can understand how markets work if it's like a market for fruits, but then that theory wouldn't apply to the theory to explain how the markets for nuts work. So we want to have a nice robust theory. So when we come and think about efficiency, we don't want to make any kind of specific assumptions about what people might like or dislike in this economy. And that allows us to think about what we have with efficiency here. Points that are on the production possibilities frontier are going to be efficient. So I have that summarized here. And what I'm going to try to do is explain why that is and why hopefully this makes sense. A point like A inside the frontier is inefficient. Why can we say that? Or why do we want to say that? Well, we don't want to assume that we know that people in this economy like food or only food or clothing but not food, or that they like them in any kind of certain ratio. We can say that they like both of these things. So if we know that people like both of these things, then one thing we could say is that if we compare any 2 points in this space here that we have graphed, if one combination of them offers more food and more clothing than the other, then it should be better. It should be better in the sense that we can give everybody more of both. We can give them the same thing what they had before, and now they can have more of both goods. And as long as we know they like both clothes and food, they're both goods, then more should be preferred to less. And so that's an assumption we can make about preferences. Let's just say if these are truly goods, more of them should be preferred to less. This also goes back to what we talked about in terms of scarcity when we said that our wants and desires exceed our capacity to fulfill them. So, we don't have to say maybe someday with some level of consumption, they might get a point where nobody needs anything else of anything more. Nobody wants any more of anything. We're not at that point. So what we can say is a minimum way of talk about preferences. If we can have more of everything, that should be better. That should be preferred to having less of everything. And so in that regard, We can now compare points A and B for suppose that this is two different situations in society. If our society was at point A, or we could be at point C, which would be better? And I think we could say that C would be better than A, just for this reason that we have both more food and more clothing at point C than at point A. So then what we could say, if our economy were to happen to be only at point A, there would be a problem. And we would call that this is inefficient. Our economy is not working well. Efficiency is our measure of performance. It's our way, in effect, sort of like grading an economy, grading the way we are trying to organize and carry out economic activity. If it's efficient, then we're going to say, like, that's a good, that's a gold star, that's a check mark, that's an A. The economy is performing well if the economy is efficient. If it's inefficient, that's a problem, and it's a problem in terms of opportunities lost. If we could have had more of both goods, like at point C, but then we only happened to get to point A, we would not, people in that economy would not be as happy as they could have. They could have more goods, and they could have more goods feasibly. And this is why feasibility is also so important when we talk about efficiency. When we think about, especially at the level of society as a whole, we move away from, when we introduce opportunity costs and alternatives, we use very concrete choices like, going to McDonald's or going to Burger King as an option for dining. Those are very concrete, very visible. We know what those options are. But at the level of society, we can't visualize all the elements of a situation. All the elements of the situation. It's very complicated. I mean, if you really want to try to think about all the goods out there in the economy and so forth, it'd be very difficult to imagine. And then it also becomes difficult to, if we don't know exactly where this frontier is, because this is a graph that we're using to help illustrate this, it can be very difficult to know whether a point like C is actually on the frontier, or maybe it's a little bit beyond the frontier. And when we come to evaluate for efficiency, it's very important that we're comparing only truly feasible or truly possible allocations in society. If we didn't focus on that, if we tried to use, like, say, point E in a comparison, then we have a problem. So suppose we get to point E here, we're comparing point C to point E. We said, like, E has more food and more clothing than C, so E must be better than C. But the problem is, E is not feasible. There's no way that this economy at this point in time, there's no way we could get to point C, point E. Point C we can get to. There's no way we can get to point E. So to use point E to say that C is in some sense not any good is a problem. This we call, like, the nirvana fallacy sometimes. A world that you can imagine where there are no constraints, where there's no scarcity, or where the roads are paved with gold, and the old saying would be that there's a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, and just things are so great, but it's not the world we live in. Well, that's a terrible way to try to judge our actual world, because the actual world is going to always fall short of utopia. And so this idea of the nirvana fallacy is, you've got to be very careful, and you only want to compare feasible allocations to other feasible allocations. So we don't want to use E to say that C is not any good. C's on the frontier. It's the best we can do, and so C is going to be efficient. But then it's going to turn out to be the case that all of the points on the frontier are going to be efficient. And that goes back to this idea of, that we don't want to say that people like food or like clothing in what kind of ratio. It's possible that maybe, the people in this economy like a lot of food and they don't care to wear a lot of clothing, or they don't care to have a lot of different types of clothing. So it's possible, depending on preferences of people in the economy, they might like a point like D. So there's nothing in that sense wrong with D. And then when we look at B, well, it's got a lot more clothing than food, But we don't want to say that's a bad thing because it's possible. Maybe we have maybe we have an economy where people like to have lots of different clothes to wear, and they don't want to have to wear the same clothes all the time. Like that's not me, but if you allow people like that, then you want to have a lot of clothing and relatively little food. So when we think of the points on the frontier, we're going to call them all efficient because the way we called point A inefficient was to say that there was some way we could feasibly have more of both goods, and that's what made A not very good. For the points that are on the frontier, given that this frontier is negatively sloped, there is no way that we could feasibly have more food and more clothing than we have at any of the points on the frontier. There's no way we could move sort of northeast from D or northeast from B, because that's more of both. We'd be moving in that direction, the northeast direction, you think of the compass. There's no way we can move to the northeast from any of the points that are on the frontier. So that's why we're going to say they're all efficient, and we're not going to say that one's better than the other, simply because in a different economy at different times, or if you're looking across different societies and they have different balances of preferences, any one of these could conceivably be for different people in different societies the best outcome that they'd say. So we'll call all these different points on the frontier efficient, but it's important to recognize A is inefficient. And when we look at trying to measure the performance of the economy, what we're really trying to make sure is that we're trying to make sure we're at some point here on the frontier and not at some point inside the frontier. But that turns out to be a very challenging thing to do. And so that's what a big part of economics is about, trying to come up with ways we can to figure out if we're actually on the frontier in our society or if we're operating inefficiently and might be inside of our frontier. Because then if we can make some changes, we could all be better off. So that's the role of efficiency here in economics, and we get a first glance at it from this production possibilities frontier.